Hey everybody, and welcome to Maximum Libertarian. Today's a special podcast slash YouTube event, if you will. We were honored at the last Roanoke Valley Libertarians meeting to have Dr. Jim Lark come in and speak to us. And the topic that he speaks about is the infighting within the Libertarian Party. Now, as many of you know, there's always been multiple caucuses and different groups that, we take a small group in the Libertarian Party and we make it even smaller by finding a little radical caucus or the Mises caucus or the Pragmatist caucus or whatever you want to, form. And I don't feel that's a good thing. I think really our goal should be to push the message of the Libertarian Party. We should be pushing individual freedoms. We should be, making sure people are not being forced by government to do something they do not want to do. And look at what's going on right now throughout this great land of ours. And we have multiple people out there saying that there should be forced vaccinations. We should be carrying around our cards to show our papers to the authorities. The government knows they can't force us to do anything, yet they can help a business or a small business make it happen where we can't enter into that thing. But that's a whole nother subject. See, that's what we should be talking about, not talking about who's libertarian, who's not libertarian, you know what I'm saying? So, yes, this took place at the Roanoke Valley Libertarian meeting on August 9th, and I want to send out a big thank you to R.T. Smith's Delicatessen downtown Roanoke, and they let us use the facility that night, and it was nice, quiet, so you can hear Dr. Lark speak about this topic. All right, so let's get together, sit back with your cup of coffee, your tea, maybe make yourself a juice, and listen to Dr. Lark. All right, see you on the other side. All right, everybody, thank y'all very much once again for coming out. Tonight's guest speaker is Dr. Jim Lark. He's been here how many years now? 11 years?
Something like that. I lost count.
Yes, but every August is his month to come and speak to us. And, he's been the national chair. He's held so many positions. I know I would forget more than I would say. So, and he's been a big leader with the Libertarian movement. And I'm glad he's able to come every August to give us some wisdom. But this month, that I asked him to talk about is because of infighting within the LP. We are at a spot where I think we're going to have success, but we can get to quicker success if we quit the infighting. I'm not saying we got to agree with everything lockstep, but hey, let's start working together, and we can do this. All right, so. Everyone, put your hands together for Dr. Jim Lark.
Well, first of all, thank you, Brian, for the invitation. I think the reason that I am asked to come down here is because they can't find any good speakers. So they sort of figure, all right, well, Dr. Lark works cheap. He got a glass of tea, so, we can get him on the cheap here. It's great to see a lot of old friends here, people I had the pleasure of knowing for a very long time. It's nice to see some new people here. I hope to have the chance to chat with you a little bit. I will note, by the way, since Dean made the comment, Dean and Brian were making the comment about gambling and the fact that there might be some ulterior motive in trying to regulate certain types of gambling. I'm reminded of the great line of a wonderful economist who once said, "What is it about alcohol and gambling that make them such horrible vices that only the government can administer them?" So always keep that in mind. Brian asked me to talk a little bit about issues of infighting. And so what I'm going to do is sort of give you Lark's worm's eye perspective on this matter. Hopefully what I will say will be helpful to you. What I think I'll do is I'll start out by talking about some general issues with respect to the topic. Talk a little bit about some of the more interesting examples we've had in the Libertarian Party, and offer some suggestions as to how we might be able to deal with it. First of all, our organization, and I'm referring to the Libertarian Party sort of writ large. Of course, there are lots of Libertarian parties. There's the national party, there are the state parties, there are the local parties. Taking it sort of writ large, our organization is an ideological organization. We have lots of people who take ideas very seriously, and we know that because they'll tell you why we take ideas very seriously. By its very nature, our organization is going to be one where there are going to be people who have differences of opinions. How do we move forward? How do we best move forward? There will be differences of opinions about what actually is libertarianism. What do we actually mean, this product we're trying to sell? So the very nature of our organization is such that we're going to have differences of opinion. That's just the nature of the beast. And indeed, as we grow, if we actually hope to win, and I want to win, I want to live in a society of liberty and responsibility, we're going to be bringing in people who, at least at the first, will probably have different opinions about what is this libertarian thing, or what should we be doing, how should we be doing it. Again, the very nature of our organization means that there are going to be differences of opinion, and given that some people perhaps have ways of expressing themselves that they don't necessarily, their humanity doesn't come through well. They perhaps express themselves not well, poorly, perhaps is the better term. Sometimes these differences of opinions can basically lead to ill feeling and ultimately ill will. Again, just the nature of the beast. With respect to our organization, there are going to be factions in our organization. People will organize along particular perspectives. They think that a particular way of presenting the material or particular issues, the way they should be emphasized, people will gather into factions, or they will come in because of factional interests. Again, this is natural. The big problem is not so much factions and disagreements. It is factionalism. What do I mean by factionalism? Any of you soccer enthusiasts, football, English, I'm a soccer enthusiast, football in the real world. And I used to play, and I was, like a lot of men my age, the older I get, the better I used to be. 2 years from now, World Cup star. In soccer, my football club is Liverpool. And if you play for Liverpool and you do a bad thing, you kick the heck out of some poor guy on the other team, well, you're not really a bad guy. You're actually a lovely lad, and you didn't really mean to break his leg, and you know, that's the game. If, on the other hand, you're playing against Liverpool and you kick the hell out of one of our guys, it's because you're Satan's little brother, and if there's any universal justice, you will burn in hell for eternity. Factionalism is, if you do something bad, but you're part of my team, my gang, my posse, well, it really wasn't that bad, or you really didn't mean to do it, and we should forgive you. If you're on the other side, you're unutterably evil. And where's the gasoline and the matches so that we can actually burn you at the stake? This is most unfortunate. Factions will exist. Factionalism, unfortunately, is what we frequently see, and that's what really causes the problems. I've been pretty fortunate. I'm flattered to say that because I've been involved. Let me step back a little bit. I've been involved in the LP now for 36 years. Joined the National Party. I've been actively involved for, well, really, I guess since about 1986. So it's actually long, getting on close to 40 years, I'm sorry. I'm flattered to say most people seem to regard me as being a pretty good guy, and I actually have been complimented. I had the honor of serving as national chair. They couldn't find anyone good, so they got stuck with me. I was complimented by people who viewed me as basically somebody who could bring people together, and that's very flattering. And the way that I did this was basically trying to treat people with courtesy and respect, trying to listen to what they had to say, and trying to treat people fairly. I think that I like to think that that reputation is an accurate one. I feel that in looking at the party and where we're going, that we are going to be able to deal with these problems of factionalism basically through a relatively simple process, and that is just treating people the right way. And I'll come back to that in a moment. With respect to the Libertarian Party, we've had some really, really, really interesting battles in the party. Some of them have been ideological. Some of them strike me as actually being more cultural, because, so those of you who've had the chance to listen to me rattle on, there are many battlefields upon which the battle for liberty takes place. There's actually a cultural battlefield, and I think that in some cases, people bring cultural concerns from their previous activities into the Libertarian Party. You have people, for example, who come from very conservative backgrounds, and the issues that they are interested in, it's not so much the ideological issue, it's perhaps more the cultural issue. What sort of problems are really the ones that ruining America? What sort of the problems are the ones we really have to take care of now? We basically, going back to, I guess the biggest early problem or battle we had was in 1983. Some of you may be aware the Libertarian Party basically split in 1983. The National Convention was held in New York City in early September. There was an effort on the part of people who became ultimately associated with the Cato Institute to basically promote more effective messaging, more sort of practical ideas for how the Libertarian Party might move the United States forward. There were other people who felt that no, we need to take more of a radical approach in terms of our messaging, in terms of our presidential ticket. These two forces came together at the New York Convention, and the force represented by the people who ultimately were involved with the Cato Institute, they basically left. And they took a large fraction of the party with them. And a goodly part of that fraction were people who were major donors. So that split, if you will, I think it really hurt the Libertarian Party. We were at a point where I think the American people were starting to look for another viewpoint. And we have this national split. By the way, just to tell you how naive I am, in case you haven't already judged this, little tidbit. Just after the National Convention occurred in 1990, I was not really involved in the party at that point. I had joined the party, but I had no connection to the National Party. When the National Convention took place, I was a visiting scholar, visiting schmuck in the math department at the University of California, Berkeley. A few days after the National Convention, I had the honor of getting together with a fellow named Patrick Cox, who at the time was the public relations director with Pacific Institute for Public Policy Research. He lived in Menlo Park, California. He was also a journalist. He wrote for Reason magazine. He appeared on CNN. Great guy. We got together for drinks in Menlo Park, and he had just gotten back from the National Convention, and he was telling me about this big split where there was, basically the party split. And my response, well, what do you mean? There were disagreements among libertarians? I mean, we're all libertarians here. You mean there was actually a walkout? How could that happen? We're all libertarians here. So I bring this up so that if you should discount whatever I say about politics, because I still have a certain naivete about my approach. So we had this big split at that time. We actually, after the split occurred, we basically kind of came back together. We were making some progress, and then around the time of the 2000 election, we had some more infighting. There was the presidential candidate in 1996 was a fellow named Harry Brown, who I think was an excellent candidate for us. I think that if we've ever had anyone who looked presidential, it was Harry Brown. I mean, you could look at Harry, you might say, I don't agree with that guy, but that guy looks presidential. He looks like he belongs in the White House. And particularly when you contrast him in '96 to Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, or in 2000 to Al Gore and George Bush. Who's the adult in the room here? It's sort of, I think most people would agree, it was Harry Browne. Well, there were some issues in terms, there was a gentleman who was a contender for the presidential nomination. He was in and then he was out, a fellow named Jacob Hornberger, who was running the Future Freedom Foundation. And Mr. Hornberger, well, I won't go into the particulars. Let's just say that there was a lot of disagreements between the people supporting Mr. Brown and the people supporting Mr. Hornberger. Again, he actually got out of the battle, but there was a lot of nastiness involved. I was elected national chair on July 3rd, 2000, and I ended up having to deal with some of this nastiness. I'm pleased to say most people felt I did a reasonably good job trying to keep the battle lines from expanding too far, to see that blood didn't, or at least not too much blood got spilled on the floor. So moving forward, we've had disagreements, at least at the national level, but by and large, we haven't had any major problems until fairly recently, where we've had this issue about, and I'm not sure exactly how to put this. It appears that we have an effort by a group of people, they call themselves the Mises Caucus. They feel the Libertarian Party has become too left, that we've been emphasizing issues on the political left, in their opinion, basically too much. And they want to see the Libertarian Party move back toward emphasizing other issues. That's not so much the problem. The problem seems to be that many of these people they basically say they're going to take over the Libertarian Party, and that sort of rubs people the wrong way. Also, we have some issues, some of the people who have been in the party for a long time, I guess you could say they're sort of represented by the immediate past the former immediate past national chair, Nick Sarwark. The immediate past national chair, Bishop Henchman, has resigned. The previous national chair was elected for 3 terms, Nick Sarwark, has basically accused the Mises people of being not very nice people, basically racist. I think that the accusations are unfair. Anyway, we now have this sort of infighting that has reemerged. It emerged in particular in the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire. By the way, a lot of times when we see these infighting problems occur, they actually occur at a state level first and then bubble up to the national level. It's most unfortunate. I've seen people who really ought to be allies who seem to be fighting against each other. They use intemperate language. In many cases, I think they're engaging in, I won't say it's mendacious, but it's certainly, they're overemphasizing certain points, and they're not being, in my opinion, completely fair. And this is on both sides of this issue. I'm not going to take sides between these two groups. So once again, it seems like every 20 years or so we have an outbreak of infighting, particularly at the national level, that hinders us from moving forward. Let me note, by the way, that the current problem, this is an issue that actually I think had been waiting to happen. I think the current problem, the current nastiness, is actually closely related to an important issue. At least it was important to people who talk about the ideological underpinnings of libertarianism. You may have heard the term thick libertarianism versus thin libertarianism. If you care about fundamental issues of libertarianism, there's been an argument that's been going on for a few years about thick libertarianism versus thin libertarianism. My way of looking at this is, I'll define thick libertarianism actually as its contrast to thin libertarianism. My view of libertarianism is that basically you have no right to initiate force against other people except you have no right to initiate it. You can defend yourself, but you have no right to initiate force. Combined with some basic axioms about the right to have and hold real property, basically governments are there to protect our rights. Governments are not instituted to basically make life fair. They're not there to be your mommy and daddy. They're not there to get you to eat your vegetables. Government has a limited function. It is to protect your rights against violation, whether from internal sources or external sources. Governments, in my opinion, have no organic property. They do not exist outside of the wishes of the people who form those governments. Governments are institutions that are formed by people. In my opinion, governments should be like clubs. There's a double entendre there. I don't mean like great big sticks. That's what the current government policy is, great big stick hitting people. Government should be like clubs in the sense that you belong to a government because you agree to be bound by certain principles. In the Larkian theory, I like the sound of that, the Larkian theory, governments, basically you can have literally a social contract. You can basically, I agree to be bound by this set of principles. And the interesting perspective from my view is that libertarianism can embrace a wide variety of different organizational forms. You can have everything from complete communism to the worst stereotype of dog-eat-dog capitalism, but as long as the polity, as long as the people who are bound by the rules have agreed to it at some fundamental level, which I think should be unanimity, people can find whatever organizational form they choose. Okay, now, why am I mentioning this? To my way of thinking, libertarianism actually does not address a lot of the big questions in life. Libertarianism to me is a political philosophy. It deals with a very narrow slice of human existence. It does not deal with, for example, the question of whether God exists. It does not deal with whether or not there are differences between groups of people, in the sense that I think you can be a libertarian and be a dreadful racist, as long as you don't, your racism doesn't manifest itself in the use of government to initiate aggression. As long as you don't aggress against people, as long as you don't have government initiating aggression against people, you can have ideas that I would consider really dreadful. But as long as you are not, as long as you don't violate what I consider to be fundamental libertarian principles, you can be a libertarian and be a dreadful racist. Now, I don't want dreadful racists in the Libertarian Party. But in terms of what it means to be a libertarian, you can have all manner of ideas that I would consider horribly retrograde. I wouldn't want to have anything to do with you outside of my involvement with a libertarian political organization, but I don't believe that your bad views mean that you're not a libertarian. Okay? I can't imagine why anyone would have notions. Well, I can't imagine why anyone would treat people badly because they happen to have different skin color, or they happen to have different affectional preferences, or they happen to have different, they happen to have different hair color or eye color. I happen to be one of those libertarians who believes, we're all brothers and sisters. Why would you treat people badly? Okay. That is what I would call thin libertarianism. In other words, libertarianism deals only with political questions. It doesn't deal with lots of other questions that are very important, but they're outside of what I would consider the libertarian perspective to involve. People who embrace the notion of thick libertarianism would say, no, libertarianism means more than just the issue about the proper relationship between the individual and the collective, the individual and the state. It means that we should embrace certain notions, such as Jim Lark's notion that we're all brothers and sisters, and that you should not treat people, you should not discriminate invidiously for silly reasons. They would actually incorporate that into the definition of libertarianism. And they call that thick libertarianism. Of course, you have all manner of discussions about these things. They've been going on for, I think, at least 20 years. I think that the current business, the sort of infighting we're now seeing, is actually in some sense a manifestation. Because if you see the arguments that are being made, if you see the reasons why people are saying, I'm leaving the LP, or I want to get involved in the LP and basically get rid of those people who I consider to be too far on the political left. These are basically issues about what really is libertarianism all about. And these are serious questions. Reasonable people can, by the way, have different notions. I actually think the Libertarian Party has every right to have in its statement of not its bylaws, but its platform. It has every right to state that we don't want racists in the party, because the Libertarian Party is a group of people. The people who form the party have the right to set whatever the bylaws and whatever the platform is. But as a matter of what actually constitutes libertarian philosophy, are you a libertarian? I believe that you can have all manner of retrograde ideas, but as long as you aren't willing to violate what I consider to be the fundamental libertarian principles, you can be if you will, you can have bad ideas and still be a libertarian. And I think that a lot of the problems that we're now seeing, a lot of the arguments that we're seeing where you have these two sort of factions coming together, basically is an outgrowth of this thick versus thin. It's a special case of this thick versus thin libertarianism issue. So, what do we do about it? Well, there's a certain what you mean we Kemosabe, because most libertarian political organizations actually are made up of people who get along pretty well. The vast majority of libertarian organizations, the Libertarian Party of Virginia, the Jefferson area Libertarians, and non-political libertarian movement organizations, actually the people get along pretty well. They manage to have their disagreements, and they realize there are going to be disagreements. As long as we uphold the highest standards of intellectual integrity and as long as we treat people the right way, there are ways of handling them. Now, I should also point out, I have not been involved in any of the state parties or the local parties where there is a fundamental disagreement about what libertarianism is all about. Those are situations where, frankly, I don't know that you're going to have anything other in those organizations other than détente. In other words, we won't kill you. We'll work together. We won't kill you. We promise we won't kill you unless you try to kill us, and then of course we'll kill you. I think that the best way for us to deal with this is for us to concentrate on trying to identify, first of all, what really do we mean, what do we want the Libertarian Party to do? And there, by the way, there is a disagreement about what should the Libertarian Party be. Let me again step back a little bit. There are many people who feel the Libertarian Party should be what we will call a destination party. There are other people who believe the Libertarian Party should be a direction party. What do I mean? A destination party is we emphasize where do we want to end up? Where is the shining city on the hill? What do we want to see in a libertarian end state? Where are we ultimately heading? What do we want to bring about? I would be called, by the way, I guess I would be a destination libertarian. I want to emphasize the shining city on the hill. I want to emphasize the moral principles behind liberty. And by the way, I am a libertarian on moral grounds, not on prudential grounds. I feel that there are very severe limitations to what people can do in terms of use of force. The vast majority of what governments at all levels do, in my opinion, violates my moral precepts. The fact that societies based on libertarian principles, or to the extent they're based on libertarian principles, the fact that they are wealthier and happier societies, that's very nice. I mean, that's really nice. But that, in some sense, is incidental. I'm ultimately a libertarian on moral grounds. And so I want to emphasize to people that there are certain things you cannot do as an individual, and you cannot do these things by proxy, by essentially enabling government to do them on your behalf. If it's not right for me to take money out of Charles's pocket, it's still not right if I basically have a vote and this thing called government takes the money outside, unless he's agreed to be bound by rules that will, which he hasn't, by the way. I can state that with certainty. There's still, within the libertarian movement, there's a very large fraction who would be considered, if you will, destination libertarians. There's also a very large fraction of the party, I'd say it's ballpark roughly half and half, who emphasize direction. Where are we heading? It may be that not everybody will want to get to the same destination, but they want to go in the same direction, basically the same direction. Gene Burns, a commentator, had this wonderful phrase, get on the freedom train. Some people will get off at an earlier stop, but we're all heading in the freedom direction. Get on the freedom train. Where do I fit? As I said, I happen to be, I guess if you put me into one of these two categories, I would be a destination libertarian. However, directional libertarians are my brothers and sisters. We're all on the same team. We may have differences of opinion about how best to move forward, but reasonable people need to realize differences of opinion will occur. And as long as, in my opinion, as long as our organizations, as long as we set forth, first of all, very clearly what the rules are for how we do our business, as long as people are scrupulously honest and fair to their colleagues, in other words, we get rid of the factionalism. Well, you know, Brian did it, and he's okay with me, so, you know, what he did was bad, but he's okay. Charles did the same thing. He's not on my team, so he'll burn in hell. As long as we are scrupulously honest and fair, as long as we treat bad actions as bad actions, and the actor doesn't change how we evaluate the actions, as long as we are scrupulously honest and fair with those to whom we are trying to reach out, I think that the issues of factionalism and the associated infighting, it's going to be around. I don't think we can ever get rid of it, but I think we can reduce it to the level where it's basically just sort of background noise. Now, contrary, I think most people would agree that if everybody in the Libertarian Party did what Jim Lark said we should do, the party would be ever so much better off. I mean, just listen to Chairman Jim, do what he says, life would be golden. There are some reprobates in the party who do not listen to me. Sad as that is. So, where do I think we're headed? In some sense, the Libertarian Party is still very much at an adolescent stage. We're still trying to figure out what we want to do. We're still trying to figure out what the best tactics, what the best strategy, what the best tactics are. I don't know if we'll ever figure it out. Again, we have different people who come to this from very different viewpoints. They come to this from very different backgrounds. Many of my best friends, by the way, in the Libertarian movement and some in the Libertarian Party, these people were Trotskyists at a young age. Some of them were neocons at a young age. People come to the Libertarian Party from all different parts of the political spectrum. I actually think in many ways that's a strength, or at least it can be a strength, but it's also a weakness. So I don't know that we're ever going to be able to reduce, we won't be able to get rid of infighting. What I hope is that by virtue of making sure that we hold ourselves to the highest standards of integrity, that we are scrupulously fair and honest with other people, and we treat people the right way. If we do that, I think we can keep the infighting to a manageable level. It should also be noted, by the way, that other political organizations, in many ways, have much worse fissures in their organizations. However, if you look at the Democrats and Republicans, they have, for the most part, figured out if they let their battles, if they let these fissures really fissure, there's a huge opportunity cost. They lose power. Libertarian Party, by and large, it's very rare for us to have anything like political power. So there's a certain sense in which if you want to engage in infighting, if you're the sort of person who believes it's my way or the highway, what's the downside? Well, you're by and large not going to lose power. the opportunity cost of being a real bastard is relatively low. You can, if our disputes get out of hand, we don't necessarily lose power. In fact, rarely do we lose power. And if you look at Democrats and Republicans, for the most part, they have all manner of battles that are every bit as nasty or nastier. Other political parties, mostly on the political left, to use those terms, in many cases, when their battles get out of hand, you actually see bodies on the floor. They actually are violent. For the most part, we don't have a lot of bodies hitting the floor. Maybe that's because we believe in right to keep and bear arms, and many people in the party are actually very well armed, and so there's a tendency not to engage in that sort of behavior, because if you decide that you're going to hit somebody over the head, they might shoot you. So, again, one of the benefits to taking a robust viewpoint on the right to keep and bear arms. So, I think that we will probably get through this. I don't see infighting, by the way. It does hurt the party. I think it is of a lesser order in terms of the problems we face. And if I may, I think the biggest problems that we face as we try to move the U.S. and hopefully the world in a more libertarian direction is, first of all, frankly, the American people just don't agree with us enough. I've heard many people say, well, everybody's naturally a libertarian. With all due respect, I don't think that's true. When people say, leave me alone is not a libertarian slogan. Leave me alone means leave me alone. Doesn't mean leave you alone. Cut my taxes means cut my taxes, not your taxes or Bill Gates's taxes. By the way, I am pleased to see that libertarian organizations such as Students for Liberty have moved from don't tread on me, to don't tread on anyone. I think that's a big improvement. So I think that we still have a lot of people out there who just don't agree with us enough on the issues. And by the way, it's not that people necessarily disagree with us on our general sweep of issues. In fact, quite the contrary. I'd be willing to bet, not a lot of money, but some, that if we devised a survey and we say to you, Mr. or Mrs. American, here are 100 issues, political issues, and here's what the Democratic response would be, here's the Republican response, here's the Libertarian response, here's the Green response, Socialist, Communist. And by the way, you don't have to have questions that would have different responses from the different. It could be the Republicans and the Democrats agree on this. The Republicans and the Libertarians and the Democrats agree on this. If you took 100 issues, that would be the most important 100 issues to the American public. I'd be willing to bet that a plurality, maybe even a majority, would have the libertarian perspective. But there are enough people in our country, I'd say frankly the vast majority, for whom there will be one or two issues where they just can't agree. So I still think that our biggest problem ultimately, in some ways, is an educational problem. It is, we have to give people an uncaricatured view of what we're all about. I will note, by the way, some of you have heard me rattle on about explaining and promoting these ideas. You as an activist, in many cases, keep in mind that you may have an extraordinary impact on the world, not by finding the next great exemplar of libertarian values, but because you clear away the misconceptions that people have about what libertarians are all about. In many cases, when I find I'm discussing ideas with people, I find that they say, well, I disagree with you libertarians. You find that what they disagree with is a very bad caricature of our ideas. They don't actually disagree with us on what we really believe. They disagree on the caricature. And if by virtue of your activism, whether it's running as a candidate, whether it's sitting at an information table, whether it's being a good neighbor, if all you do is help clear away the misconceptions, you can move that ball down the field a very long way, particularly in politics, because in many cases, What motivates people to be involved in politics is not because they like you, it's because they hate you. And if we can get people to the point where they think, those libertarians, doggone it, I disagree with them on some important issues, but if they were put in positions of responsibility, the world's not going to go to hell. That those libertarians, they're good people, they mean well, they actually agree with me on a lot of the major problems, they just have different ways of looking at it. So I think that the biggest problem for us is basically still making sure that people understand what it is that we want to do. Also, keep in mind that for at least 100 years, the push has been basically for greater government involvement in the lives of the people. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to reorient fundamentally the way they look at what's the relationship between the individual and government. And I think it was T.S. Eliot who referred to the provincialism of time. In many cases, if you have grown up in a society where you've never seen how people coming together charitably, voluntarily, can deal with the major problems of the human condition, it might seem utterly fantastic that voluntary, charitable, civil society can deal with those problems, or at least can deal with them at least as well as any sort of conceivable alternative arrangement. So I see that we still have a lot to do in terms of the educational front. And I think the Libertarian Party, libertarians, LP members, are probably the least likely to give credit to the LP for actually moving the ball down the field. We now have many libertarian organizations, movement organizations, where the individuals got their start through Libertarian Party activism. And the Libertarian Party introduced people to the word libertarian and the ideas behind it. So I think that the LP has done, that's our LP, not the LP of the lady who wants to. I think the LP has actually done a pretty good job of explaining a lot of these ideas, but we have a lot more. Some of the other problems that I think are actually bigger problems than the infighting is we're playing in a rigged game. Our political opponents get to set the rules for us. And now this is going to come as a shock to some of you. They don't play fair. I can see this shocked looks on your faces. We also have a situation where, and this has been understood for about 250 years, not well enough understood, I hate to say. Government actions that are beneficial are easily visible, and the beneficiaries know who they are. The cost of government action, which may be vastly greater than the aggregate benefit, the costs are diffused, and the victims, and in many cases there are victims, there are actually bodies that stack up, may never know who they are. Perfect example, Food and Drug Administration. By keeping substances off the market that might be helpful to some people, the victims of those actions may never know who they are. The business that was not started by virtue of regulation or taxes or all manner of government interference, the people who could not start their business may not know who they are. The people who were not hired may never know who they are. So we're facing this horrible asymmetry between clear benefits and beneficiaries versus unseen costs, diffuse costs, unseen victims. That's a tough game. Also, by the way, and this goes into the point that I frequently make about how do we explain our ideas. We libertarians, in many cases, are put in positions where we have to explain why we should opt for liberty. And I think that that's a mug's game. I think that whenever we're talking to people, if they want to talk seriously, we should make sure that the default value in any conversation is liberty. In other words, in a nominally free society, we of libertarian disposition should not have to tell you why or prove that liberty works better. The burden of proof should always be upon those who would use the coercive mechanism of the state. So we should always try to change the rhetorical battleground so that we shouldn't have to defend liberty. The people who would argue in favor of government action is ultimately backed up by force. In many cases, I would say illegitimate force. Most cases, damn near all cases. The burden of proof should be upon those who would argue in favor of government action. We should not have to face that burden. The burden should be on them. And there are a few other problems that, of course, I could talk about ad nauseum. But I think that as we look forward, we have made a lot of progress. When I first heard about the libertarian perspective in a serious way, it was actually the day before the 1976 presidential election, when my professor of electricity and magnetism at Virginia Tech decided we wouldn't talk about electricity and magnetism, we talk about the proper relationship between the individual and the state. We have made, in many ways, enormous progress. On the intellectual battlefield, I think that the growth of interest in what I will call libertarian institutions, market-based arrangements, voluntary arrangements to deal with the problems of society, I think we've made enormous progress. In fact, if you look at the intellectual battlefield, I think right now, to the extent that there is a dominant perspective and orthodoxy, it is what I'll call welfare state liberalism. In other words, there are not that many people, fortunately, who actually believe seriously in socialism. And most of the young people you're talking about, I like socialism, what they're talking about is the welfare state liberalism of other countries like Sweden or Denmark. In the United States, to the extent there's an orthodoxy, it is welfare state liberalism. In other words, people do actually nominally own property, but we really don't own it, we rent it. We have to pay substantial taxes, where it's heavily regulated. We have very large welfare state institutions. But we still have, compared to a lot of places in the rest of the world, we still have a fair degree of liberty. I would say the number one contender to the welfare state liberalism perspective is not socialism, certainly not Marxism. Marxism, it's not dead yet. But as they would say in a Monty Python sketch, it's not at all well. Even the English Marxists, who are amongst the nastiest bastards on the planet, even they have been mugged to some extent by reality. You actually now talk about market socialism, where the idea is you use markets to allocate resources, because if you try to allocate resources through non-market means, in many cases you get a whole lot of nothing. So the idea is you use market mechanisms to try to overcome the knowledge problem. But then once you get the goods out of the woods, you then allocate them via other means. Now that's not going to work terribly well, but at least there are people who have been mugged by some reality. They do actually understand some economics now. I would say that the leading contender, if we were putting in boxing terms, the leading contender to the orthodoxy is actually libertarianism. And the people on the welfare state liberalism side, they realize that they're in a real battle. And they see a lot of the bright, talented young scholars who are interested in these ideas of how can societies organize without essentially the coercive mechanism of the state. So I see a lot of good things happening on the intellectual battlefield, but translating that into the larger society is not an easy thing to do. Particularly when in many cases the people who are in charge of the educational mechanisms by which many of these ideas about history, sociology, political science, and the like are distributed, they tend to be in the welfare state liberalism camp. So it may take us a while before the intellectual, or the victory on the intellectual battlefield is actually manifest itself in real ways, or much more important ways in the real world. But I see some very good signs. But we need to understand, we're arguing in many cases we're going against at least a 100-year thrust in terms of greater reliance upon the state, greater reliance upon essentially the mechanism of force to get the results you want. And it's hard to turn that around. So with that, I hope that my comments have been helpful to you. I don't know, again, that I don't have a solution for infighting. I don't think a solution exists. What I think is the best way to try to keep it from getting out of hand is we first of all have to look at ourselves in the mirror. We have to say, am I scrupulously fair with those with whom I'm dealing? By the way, one of the problems I see, if I may digress a little bit, when I see the things going on in terms of that wonderful medium of exchange called Facebook, it's fascinating to watch how a little misinterpretation here then spins to a little interpretation there, but a bigger little interpretation, which then manifests itself in an even bigger misinterpretation. And then by the end of this channel, you see people say, was that on camera? Okay.
I think you actually pulled it to the left when you did that. So, there you go.
And there are lots of other gestures. I could show you several, but I won't. It's fascinating to watch chains of discussion among people who ought to be, you would think, are reasonably thoughtful people, watching the misconceptions spin out of control. And so you actually get people who, if they were to be scrupulously honest and fair, so that those discussions focused on real issues, I think you'd see a lot less of the nastiness. Because most people, I would like to think, they realize sometimes reasonable people are going to differ. Some people in the Libertarian Party are going to say we need to move in this direction. Other people with equal validity, or they have an equally strong argument, will say no, we need to move in an orthogonal direction. If they basically realize, okay, wait a minute, this person on the other side is not evil. We disagree, but he's not evil. He's basically we're on the libertarian team. We can simply say, all right, we're going to disagree, and maybe I'll go out and I'll recruit more people to be on my side who agree with me that this is the right way to go. But we keep the discussion focused on real things, real disagreements, as opposed to letting personalities get in the way. And I think that ultimately comes from you have to adopt a code of ethics, if you will. I'm going to be scrupulously honest and fair. I'm going to set the highest standard of integrity for myself. I'm going to treat arguments that I may not like, but I'm going to treat them as serious arguments. If I have disagreements, I will set forth the disagreements. I will try to keep everything on a professional level. It's like the mafia. I was watching The Godfather. Yeah, I always watch The Godfather when it's on TV. It's nothing personal. It's just business. If we set the highest standards of integrity, of courtesy, and respect, I think a lot of the problems of infighting will be reduced substantially. Because in many cases, when we look at the infighting, what is it really? It's come down to basically, you're a POS. I don't like you. I don't like your mother or father. I don't like your children. It's become personal. If to the extent that we can keep the arguments on a purely professional level, where we realize reasonable people are going to have disagreements. I mean, I don't know what the best path is. I learned my crystal ball broke a long time ago. When people said, Jim, what's the best, what should we be doing to move the Libertarian Party forward? My answer is, I don't know. My short answer is, I don't know. The longer, more nuanced answer is, I don't know, but I have some ideas. I don't know what the best path is. I don't think, by the way, anyone knows. And so my feeling is what we want to do in all of our organizations is, again, at the risk of sounding remarkably repetitive, be scrupulously honest, be scrupulously fair, treat people with courtesy and respect. When you have arguments, try to say, wait a minute, let me be sure I understand what you're saying. Because in so many cases, one misunderstanding can basically start off, and basically you see this thing spinning out of control. If people will be scrupulously fair to say, wait a minute, did I understand you correctly? Maybe I don't understand you. When you said this, is this what you meant to say? By the way, just as I will confess, I have always tried to give people who said really stupid things, I've tried to give them graceful ways to back away. In most cases, if you give people a graceful way to back out when they did something stupid or bad, they'll usually take it, and you can then say, okay, let's move forward. So again, it ain't rocket science. It's not going to solve all the problems, but I think it will reduce the problems of infighting to ones where they're manageable. And then we can work on the real problems, which are a lot harder to deal with. So with that, I will say thank you for your attendance. I'm flattered that anybody comes out to hear me say anything. I can't imagine why people do, but maybe you didn't have anything else to do tonight. And I'll be happy to answer questions. By the way, my email address, I'll give you my UVA email. Actually, let me give you my other email address. It's JWLARK, JWLARK III for JWLARK the third, JWLARK III at gmail.com. If I can be of any help to you, please don't hesitate to contact me. Helping my friends is my favorite indoor sport. And if you like my talk and you say, Dr. Lark, that was a talk of surpassing elegance and excellence. I got an ego. I like it when people say nice things. It happens very rarely, but I like to hear it. Let me know. If you think, Jim, I can't imagine that I wasted this much time listening to you screw things up, let me know. I will probably cry myself to sleep that night, but I need to know that so that I won't waste people's time in the future, or at least I hope I won't waste people's time in the future. So let me know if I can be of any assistance to you, and I'll be happy to open up to questions, comments, arguments if you got them. So what can I do for you?
So you mentioned that the main division is between the thick libertarians and the thin libertarians.
I think that the current battle, at least I've seen, from what I know of the discussion of thick libertarianism versus thin libertarianism, it seems to me that a lot of the current battle, if you will, basically comes because there are people in the party who feel, I'll use a specific name, Dr. Tom Woods, who's a podcaster. There are people who have said there are things in his background that mean he's a racist, or at least he's willing to tolerate racists. I don't know whether that's true. My gut feeling is it's not true. At least what I have seen, I don't think that's true. At the very least, I don't think it's fair. There are a lot of things, by the way, that can be true but are not fair. There are a lot of statements that are literally true but are not really fair. And so when I see these arguments, I won't mention the name, but a friend of mine has basically decided to get out of the LP because he feels that the party is moving in a direction of being vastly too conservative, and he said basically racist and homophobic. He has not provided what I consider to be a well-reasoned case for what has actually caused this. In other words, he hasn't provided the particulars, a bill of indictment. But he's somebody that I like and respect. And when I look at some of his comments, to the extent that they are coherent, it seems to me that he's basically saying that libertarianism should be a philosophy which has these other commitments that, again, people who use that phrase, thick libertarianism, would say, yes, there ought to be these commitments on certain issues that are not, from my perspective, focused just on the issue of the use of force in society. They would say, no, you actually have to be anti-racist. I don't like racism. I personally don't feel that I have to be an anti-racist. I don't want to tolerate racism, but I don't know that I necessarily should make it my life's work to try to convince you not to be a racist, to be against racism. I will try to live my life in a way where racism, basically, people are shown who are racist, basically reconsider it. But I don't feel I have to browbeat people. That I would rather spend my time trying to get people to deal with how they act as opposed to how they think. And I think that a lot of the people who are pushing for anti-racism, what they're worrying about is what people think and not necessarily what people do. I'm more concerned with what do you do. If you happen to be, there are a lot of people who I'm sure don't like me because I'm a Virginia Tech person, because I'm a libertarian, I'm a Liverpool supporter. I have a wide variety of reasons why people could dislike me. The fact that they dislike me doesn't bother me terribly much. If they hit me with a stick, or if they try to restrict my ability to like Virginia Tech or Liverpool or something like that, that does bother me. So my focus in terms of dealing with people, I'll be blunt, it's not so much what they think, it's how do they act. I'd rather emphasize how do they act. The fact that you might have all manner of retrograde ideas, if you actually act upon those retrograde ideas by using force, by improperly using force, that's a problem. The fact that you just have those retrograde ideas, that's a problem, but it's not, in my opinion, the most important problem. I'd rather deal with the problems of what do people do. In many cases, people who are all sweetness and light, right up until the point where they say, yeah, you should be put in a cage because you have a different recreational habit. By the way, I'm a teetotaler with respect to drugs that, for the most part, are now being legalized. I'm a teetotaler. My drug use is beer. Lots of beer. Usually judicious applications with a 55-gallon drum. I do drink wine. I do drink various fruit-flavored brandies. I do use Tylenol, and I have been known to drink lots of coffee and tea. By the way, Tim Slagle, the comedian, used to talk about, in Utah, a thermos bottle is drug paraphernalia. Okay. I thought that was funny. So I'm a teetotaler with respect to issues of drug use. I think people who would put someone in jail because they use a recreational substance and they're not hurting anyone else, I think that's very, very bad. They may have all manner of ideas that I like in terms of how they think about people of different cultures, different races, different affectional preferences, but if they're willing to put you in jail for things that really are not violations of other folks' rights, that worries me. So I tend to focus upon what do people do, and that means what are they willing to subject other folks to in terms of criminal penalties, civil penalties, when rights violative action is not involved. So the fact that you may have these retrograde ideas, if you ask my opinion, I'll be perfectly happy to give you my opinion. It's free, which may be a lot more than it's worth. But I don't feel, I don't want to devote my time essentially to changing your thoughts on how you regard other people. I am willing to put in some time trying to keep you from doing bad things to other people. How are your actions affecting other people? Am I making the distinction clear?
Thin libertarian?
Pardon?
That's the thin libertarian.
Yeah, I'm a thin libertarian. I am the.
That's just
To me,
no baggage.
To me, the libertarian philosophy is essentially dealing with the initiation of force, and what's the proper relationship between the individual and this thing called government. Your opinions about all manner of issues, should gays burn in hell? Should people with should we repulse the yellow peril? Should black people go back to Africa? I think these are horribly retrograde ideas. I can't imagine why anybody would think of another human being by looking at something as silly as the color of the skin or your eyes or your hair color. Why would you do that? But in terms of how I'm going to try to make the world a better place, I'm going to focus more on, yes, you may have these ideas. Are you trying to do something that violates these important moral principles concerning use of force? That's what I want to concentrate on. If other people in the libertarian movement, if they want to concentrate on, say, change your ideas about other people in terms of these issues, that's fine. That's not where I feel, one, my comparative advantage is, and two, frankly, I think a bigger problem is how do people act toward each other as opposed to what do they think about each other. There are lots of people who I'm sure my neighbors They're nice people. I think some of them consider me a bit crazy because of my libertarian stuff. And maybe they're right. But none of them dump trash on my property. None of them come in and bang, they don't do anything that hurts me or my stuff. If they want to think bad thoughts about me, well, that's not nice. I would hope that they would see what a wonderful person I am. But if they don't, it's not going to cause me to cry myself to sleep. If they start doing things that violate my rights, that is a problem, and I will address that. So, am I making myself clear? Again,
Okay, what is the thick?
Well, first of all, not all people who I suspect consider themselves thick libertarians would necessarily agree to what exactly the thickness is. The idea is that there needs to be moral commitments that are I would say are aside from this issue about the use of force. In other words, and I've actually seen a fairly prominent philosopher who said we should actually libertarianism should actually be against racism. And I don't mean racism in the sense of how it's actually administered in terms of separate but equal or bringing people over on boats in chains. I mean, we should be against people who have retrograde ideas. That it's the ideas themselves that violate libertarian principles. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I am a thin philosophically, I'm a thin libertarian. I'm increasingly thick in the sense of girth, and some people would say I'm thick because I'm not very smart. He's a bit of a thick lad. But in terms of my perspective on libertarianism, I am very much a thin libertarian. I think that libertarianism deals with a very narrow slice of the human condition. It doesn't deal with other concerns. It's not that those other concerns aren't important, it's just they're outside of what I feel the libertarian perspective needs to deal with. This is why, by the way, I don't think when people say I'm a conservative, not a libertarian, to me they're mixing apples and oranges. Conservatism is a view of the world. It is not, in my opinion, a political philosophy. It has political implications. I think you can be a conservative and a libertarian in the sense that you may feel, for example, that social institutions, that there are reasons why, things such as manners, cultural institutions, that they have value that has emerged in some sort of natural selection process over the centuries. For example, you don't marry your sister. That there are certain prudential values that emerge over. You may be a conservative in the sense that you feel that human nature is not malleable or not really that influenced by the means of production. In other words, changing the means of production does not change human nature. Conservatism, to my way of thinking, is much more a view of the world. It's not a narrow political philosophy. Libertarianism, to my way of thinking, is a very narrow political philosophy. It deals with the essential issues of politics. How do you define the polity? How do you define the relationship between the individual and the collective? It's a big part of human affairs, but it's in many ways very narrow compared to a lot of issues that people have in terms of society. And so, again, I want to emphasize, if I'm going to go out and try to reach out to people, I'm more interested in how do they act as opposed to their basic, how do they look at other people. I'm not saying that the second part or the latter part is not important, but it is, in my opinion, it is of lesser importance than how do people act. What do they actually do? Do they actually hit you over the head with sticks? Do they actually support legislation that will put people in jail for things that don't violate the rights of others? That's what I want to focus upon. So, does that really distinguish things? In some sense, I define thick libertarianism in reference to thin libertarianism. Thick libertarianism is sort of the not thin libertarianism. I mean, that's from what I can tell, that's basically how those people who would embrace thick libertarianism, they simply argue that libertarianism needs to have these other values.
Like I said, they're kind of bringing in stuff that's things that are on the periphery, things that aren't related to the use of force necessarily, more like individualism.
Well, it's again.
If we're individualists, we're not going to be racist because that goes against the whole principle of objectivity.
Well, and of course, people who come from an objectivist perspective, in many cases, would say racism is evil because it's collectivist thinking, and so you can't be an objectivist and be a racist because you're subscribing to this sort of impure thoughts. That's fine with me. I'm not an objectivist. I'm sympathetic toward a lot of objectivism, but I'm not an objectivist. To me, libertarianism deals with that very narrow slice of human existence. It doesn't deal with issues about race or affectional preference or things like that. It just doesn't. So to me, it's definitional. And there are people who would say, no, you've got a crabbed definition. You should have a much broader definition. So I think, again, a lot of this current infighting stuff, it is in some ways a manifestation of the thick and thin discussion that has been held, by people who, in some cases, have far too much time on their hands.
Does it kind of match up to left and right at all?
Her husband's died. She can't go out in the job market. I don't want to see her thrown out of her apartment or her house because she can't pay taxes. I don't want to see her thrown out of the house for not being paid taxes for a lot of reasons. I want to see a society where people help their neighbors because it's the right thing to do, not because somebody either directly or by proxy put a gun to their head. I want to see a society where you help your neighbors because that's what neighbors do. But it also requires that the people who need help have to be responsible for their actions, and they have to own up if they didn't pull their share of, if they didn't help pull the wagon. So I want to see a society where true civil society is the way that we deal with the vast majority of the vicissitudes of human existence. I don't want force to be the first response. Force should only be used when it involves violations of rights. And so I want to see a society where we have a better society because we have better people, because people have adopted better ideas. And I think helping your neighbors who through no fault of their own need help, I think that's a better system. I'm perfectly willing to take a non-trivial fraction of my income to pay in to help people who are in distress, because life can kick you up the backside really, really hard. I've been remarkably fortunate. I like to say, God looks after fools and Englishmen, and I'm not English. I've been remarkably fortunate in my life. A lot of people haven't been fortunate. And I think we should care about our neighbors. And I'm perfectly willing to pay into a pool voluntarily. You don't have to force me. One, because I think it's the right thing to do. Also, on purely prudential grounds, I might be one of those people who need it at some point. But also, by the way, if I were ever to reach into the common pool and pull out something, what would I would want to work really hard so that I could pay back and put in. Because I don't want anyone to go to trouble to help me. I would hope that if I'm in distress, if I ask my friends to help me, I would hope that they would. But if they don't, I have no right whatsoever to force them, either directly or by proxy. And in fact, I would be really upset if someone else were to force people to help me. I want to see a good society as well as a just society. And unfortunately, I think that the push toward greater government involvement, it's not going to get us to a better society. In fact, I think that we see the results. It's moving us in the direction of a more coarse, uncaring society. So.
All right. Well, it's 9 o'clock, so thank you very much for coming and speaking. Once again, thank you all for coming out and attending. Thank you, R.T. Smith and Keith, for letting us use your facility tonight. Thank you very much. And so that's it. If anyone's interested, we're going to go over corned beef. We'll have an adult beverage if you would like, or soda or water. And so hopefully I'll see you next month or at one of the events. Please check us out on Facebook. or wherever else, or on rblp.org. We'll have all of our events listed, all right? So thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
Dr.
And
Lark.
thank you for the tea.
Everybody, there you go. There's the Dr. Jim Lark speech to the Roanoke Valley Libertarian meetings for 2021. So, once again, thank you, Dr. Lark, for coming out and speaking to us about that topic. I also want to send out a big thank you to R.T. Smith's Delicatessen on Campbell Avenue for allowing us to have that space. It was nice to have a room where we could actually hear them and not have to yell over each other because of the noise. But the other location is a phenomenal joint. But thank you all for listening. Please subscribe to this channel. Click the notification bell. We would greatly appreciate that. Like and share this video. And my friends, until next time, I will see you later.